Hello, it's Daniel Rothschild here. How's it going? I just want to talk a bit about anarchy versus limited government. Probably one of the best articles that I read is called "The Contradiction in Anarchism" by Robert Benato, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's an objectivist, and he wrote probably one of the best criticisms of anarchy that I've read. And now I'm an anarchist, but I just want to use his article and criticize his article and why what he's saying is maybe a criticism in anarchy. There's no perfection, but a government is not going to solve that criticism. It's just going to make it worse. So one of the things in the article he mentions is how that anarchists are always saying that they want a competition in defense. But what they really want is a competition in deciding what rights are, because who gets to decide what is considered defense and what is considered offense? Not even anarchists themselves agree with each other what is considered offense and defense. There are certain libertarians and certain anarchists who say that abortion is perfectly consistent with the non-aggression principle because the woman owns her body and therefore she is allowed to have an abortion, and other people say that no, that is trampling on the rights of the fetus, and therefore that's not consistent with the non-aggression principle. So even libertarians and anarchists themselves don't agree. So since there's disagreement, it's not just as simple as saying we want a competition in defense, because who's to say that abortion is considered offensive or defensive? They really want to decide who decides what is considered right and not rights. How do we know that something is initiatory violence or not? Now, I would say that the problem with this criticism is that it's not solved by having a government, because if we are making the claim that it isn't self-evident that rape is wrong and murder is wrong and all these things, and that we don't know, well, a government is not that a government is decided based on voting, and that the people in government themselves may disagree. But the only difference is that in government, it's a monopoly. So if they disagree and they vote on victimless crimes, everyone within that arbitrary geographical area has to follow it. Whereas if we have a corrupt agency that engages in offense instead of defense, that's not binding on everyone. In fact, it's binding pretty much on no one, because who's going to want to use that offense agency? If I may go into a little about states' rights, for instance. Now, I think any consistent libertarian and any consistent ANCAP, certainly while we have a government, and a central government, has to support states' rights. Now, all states' rights is another way of saying decentralization, because states' rights are more important than central government's rights, and cities' rights are more important than states' rights, and street rights are more important than city rights, and individual rights are more important than streets' rights. So decentralization as small as possible. Now, what's the reason you should have decentralization? Well, the reason you should have decentralization is, suppose that they take a vote and they say, okay, we're going to vote to see whether abortion should be legal or not. Well, if it's the entire country who votes, and they say, okay, abortion is illegal, now if you want to have an abortion, you have to leave the entire country to do so. Where if it's voted on state by state or city by city, you don't have to leave the entire country. You can just leave your state. And if it's done city by city, then you could just leave your city. And if it's done street by street, then you could just leave your street. That is the argument for decentralization. Not that states are not corrupt, not that states are protectors and the central government is corrupt, but that you have more options if there's decentralization. That's why a one-world government would be hell, because if you had a one-world government and then they voted on something, it would be illegal everywhere. And the only place you could go is some island that the government has not claimed yet. So that's the argument for decentralization. And that's the argument that I would say here, that if we're going to make the claim that it's not so clear what is considered offensive and defensive, well, having a government with uniform laws is not the way to solve the issue either, because the people who enter government, they know what is considered offensive and defensive. They are so much smarter than everyone else, but the people in government aren't. So government doesn't solve that problem. Um, Another criticism that I've heard, and this is by Jan Helfeld, uh, when he was debating with Stefan Molyneux, and Jan Helfeld said that yes, we see the state commit the most amount of violence, but the reason is because the state has made anyone else who uses violence a crime. So the reason we'll see the state committing more acts of aggression than anyone else is because they've outlawed those acts of aggression, and it's the seen and versus the unseen. And we don't seen we there would be much more acts of aggression if the state didn't outlaw it. So it's because the state stops these aggressors. And the reason we should have a monopoly on the use of violence, Jen Helfeld is arguing, is that if there is a corrupt person who the government can say, and violent, the government can say, sorry, we have a monopoly on force and we're not going to let you harm anyone. And if the government has a monopoly on force, no other violent person can possibly defy their orders. They're going to have to listen because they have a monopoly on force. But if we have private defense agencies, it's whatever defense agency is the strongest. And if there's a strong, aggressive agency, then they can say fuck you to the defense agency and commit the violence. Now, what I think is interesting about this argument is that, to me, this is an argument not for minarchy, but actually an argument for the anarchy and the impossibility of limited government. Because if what Jan Helfeld is saying is that a monopoly on violence ensures that all violent dissenters, the government is strong enough to stop, how much more so can it stop non-violent dissenters? Which means it can stop pretty much everyone. So if it's able to stop violent dissenters, it's also able to stop non-violent dissenters, which means the people cannot stop government from doing what they want to do, which means that there are really no limits on government. The only way government can be limited if government is just good and they decide, you know what, let's limit it, but not because the people are able to stop it. You could say, I want there to be limited government because I think it's good, but, we could talk philosophy until we're blue in the face, and, I could say I want to go on dates and not want to have to pay for the woman to have coffee. Well, I want to say I want to live, forever and never die. But that's not how life works. That's not how human nature is. So, limited government might be a nice idea, but in theory, I don't think it works. Certainly, no government has stayed small, and there's no reason for them to. The bigger they grow, the more power they can have, and we constantly see government propaganda. I think the fact that propaganda exists at all should be evidence enough that government doesn't care about protecting its citizenry. Because if government cared about protecting the people, there would be no need to convince people to give them more and more resources and more power if government was truly dedicated to protecting people. But they're not. They're just dedicated to taking more and more and more and more and more, and we see how they constantly are doing this everywhere in every state.